Welcome to Akronhiphop.cpm, where we paint positive images of our people every single day. My name is Deborah Calhoun, and I teach in the Department of Pan-African Studies at Kent State University. Hey, Brother Hiram, how are you today?
What's happening? I see you gray, but you're looking great.
Gray and grown.
Gray and grown?
Gray and grown.
Very beautiful. And what
Thank
we talking
you.
about today?
Today we are going to explore another chapter in building our African history study library. And this is a classic made by and written by one of the people, the historians in the field, Dr. Walter Rodney. He was from Guyana, the same country in the bottom part of the Lesser Antilles chain where Ivan van Sertima is from, or was from. And he wrote a book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. And the point of his book was to talk about the systemic way in which Europe underdeveloped Africa when they first touched each other in the 15th century. In his text, he goes through several pre-chapters, I like to call them, where he talks about the issue of what is development. Now, he takes it from what we think development is, having more money, having more material things, having more acquisitions in the economic sense, and he looks at it in the social dynamic or in the social realm, where he looks at how African societies developed from traditional means, using their culture and their history and their experience as the guide. And that as these city-states, as we would know them as, that developed, they developed not only increased capacity to build economic potential and production potential, but they were also able to increase and flourish because not only were individuals benefiting, but the whole of society developed. So he takes time to look at what was called city-states. And city-states are those periods of development where Africans were able to live in larger and larger pieces and parts of territory, easily 10 to 15,000 people in one locale. He talks about those qualities of those city-states, that is having a solid economic base of sharing and trading, having a solid, consistent food production capacity, having segmented society, that is, there were specialists, people who were farmers, people who were the philosophers, people who were the artisans, people who were the social dancers and cultural performers and griots and things of that sort. All of these things went into characteristics of what we would know of as city-states. Ghana, Mali, Songhai, Benin, Kanem-Bornu, Zimbabwe. These were all city-states and had, though maybe different ways of making a living. For example, East Africa, which were pastoralists, following the herding animals, versus West Africa, where they were more sedentary, growing agricultural products to sell and barter and trade with people outside of their network. But these were all collectively examples of development. So it's not just one set of people making money, but rather the entire of society growing and developing. So he takes time looking at this development from a collective or comprehensive whole, and he looks at what was going on in later chapters of his text, what was going on in Europe relatively at the same time. We're talking about the 12th, 13th, 14th centuries, where Africa was easily on par in terms of population and ability to impact not only their environment, but to impact people outside of their realm and environment. So Africa pretty much was on par with Europe before the slave trade. He talks about this because he thinks it is important, and it is in fact important, that we know Africa having development before Europe touched it. We think that only Europe had the grand idea of civilization, but in fact, Africa had it, and Herodotus wrote about it. He wrote about cross-current ventilation. He talked about aqueducts. He talked about folks rocking silk. He talked about an extensive trading network through barter and trade, silent barter, dumb barter, things of that type. And he talks about the ability of the city-states, wherever they were found, able to impact their neighbors. That is, they were looked to for trade, looked at for goods that a locale didn't have. And that's what trade, in fact, does. I trade salt for silver. I take the silver and make jewelry with it. You take the salt and you uh, um, produce and preserve foods with it, for, if you will. So there was this dynamic that was going on between these city states, such that Africa indeed had development and was able to be easily on par with what Europe was doing. Now, there's other texts that talk about what Europe was doing at the same time, but we know Africans were able to not only master the physical environment, they were also able to master the stars, seeing the universe, the Dogon, if you will, the Zimbabwe cultural centers and pieces and buildings in the places in Zimbabwe, if you will, as well. So Africa was able to have development across the spectrum that was able to impact others. In fact, folks went south for information, that is, from crossing the Mediterranean into North Africa and eventually East Africa and West Africa as well. And even in some cases, he talks about trade that was going on with East Africa and that of China. But he talks about this in his whole text. And he then talks about what it was about the characteristics of the slave trade that destabilized this development. We know that the slave trade interrupted Africa development. He argues even before the slave trade, or had the slave trade not happened, Africa would easily have been on par with Europe. And his premise of the book, remember, is that Africa was able to be on par. It wasn't exactly like what Europe had going on, but it was just a click or so behind. It had not mastered and moved to what's called that nation state level of development. But Africa indeed was on its way before the slave trade. We know the slave trade disrupted society. We know it tore apart families. We know it took societies that were at surplus and plenty and trading and sharing down to what's called subsistence. Subsistence meaning able to eat only for the day, then going out and foraging and finding food for the next day. There was no extra added to where they didn't have to look for food every day. So they, through this process, he talks about, as it happened over time, it destroyed African civilizations. It destroyed that fabric. It destroyed the family. It destroyed the community. And these are the things that we are left with. In fact, I remember hearing a historian talk about the fact that often when we look at ancient Africa, we're looking at what was left after the trauma of the slave trade, not what its greatness once was, but rather what was left in the wake of the destruction of the slave trade. So he spends time talking about these features and these characteristics, and he also talks about that this idea of underdevelopment, meaning as Africa involved itself more in the European realm of economy and operations, it fell further and further and further behind in its development. So that's what the text is about. It's how Europe underdeveloped Africa. He also challenges this notion of the supposedly benefits of colonial rule, because we know after the slave trade came colonial rule. So that's how Europe underdeveloped Africa. This is just a Cliff Notes version of the text. I would invite you to grab this book among others and read. And I will say, I will see you again next time. But before I leave, I want to remind you that when you see this video on YouTube, remember to share, and share alike. If you want to find me, I'm Diamond in the Rough on YouTube. I'm History Sister on Twitter. And of course, you can also find me on Akronhiphop.cpm. So I thank you for your time today, and I will see you next time.